This is an SM Media production.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the debut episode of the SM Media Book Club. I'm Scott McPike. It's a pleasure to be your host as always. During this show, we're going to have a lot of these shows going forward where we're going to chat to authors from all over different subjects. We're going to ask them about what their plans were starting a book, the process of writing a book, and obviously the subject they have chosen. To join me on the first episode, I'm delighted to welcome onto the show. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Michael McEwan, the author of Gallus, Scotland, England, and the 1967 World Cup. One of the most fascinating subjects that I can think of to write a book on. Michael, it's a privilege to welcome you onto the show. Thank you very much for being my first guest in this new show.
No, thank you very much indeed. A pleasure to join you, and the privilege is mine to be the first of what I'm sure is many guests going to be on this show. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Yep, it's a fascinating subject, writing a book. Obviously, it's something I've got a keen interest on. It's something that I admire anybody who spends the time writing a book. It's a long process, and I'm sure you'll kind of writing three. This is your third, isn't it?
That was my third, yeah.
London Marathon book, the third one. I want to get your thoughts on that in a wee while, and then Gallus. Like three books in, it must not have been that hard the first time to if you're now 3 books in.
Oh, it's funny. The first one was slightly different in the sense that I had this idea for a book about the London Marathon, and I've run it a few times. So it's like 26.2 miles, and I thought, you know what? Let's write a book where every chapter is somebody else's story, and we'll do 26 of those. So there you go, 26 chapters, 1 per mile, dead easy. And so it was quite straightforward in some respects because I just had to find 26 people who I thought had interesting stories to tell, each of them different to one another. So we had former champions of the race, we had celebrity runners, we had a big section of the fun runners, I guess you would call them, and they'd overcome all kinds of things, from tragedies to just life getting in the way of their plans, and others that were just a bit madcap and a little bit eccentric, which I think sums up the London Marathon quite nicely. It's just a big melting pot of people and personalities. So when I found all of those people, all I really had to do was interview them and then write their story in my words. That was well, that's not strictly true, their words, but I wrote it, in my style. So I effectively ghost wrote 26 sort of mini London Marathon autobiographies. So that was, in a strange way, probably lulled me into a false sense of security when it came to writing the next one, which was the third Lanark book. And that was the first one where I was responsible for absolutely every single word that went on the page. And yeah, it's a completely different process, but it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing it. And yeah, you can probably guess I enjoyed doing it because I went and did another one within, what was that, 2 years between the two books. So yeah, you're quite right. It's a long process. You have to be really committed to the process and have a real clear plan in terms of what you want to achieve, objectives and so on, and narrative structure. But I enjoy it. I mean, there's nothing I love more than writing. So I've been a journalist now 20 years, and I've had to deal with word counts throughout that entire time. When somebody turns to you and says, give us 100,000 words, then that's music to my ears. Absolutely loved it.
The fascinating thing with obviously the third Lanark book is it's a story that I would say kind of 90% of Scottish football fans will have heard the name Third Lanark, but there's only really a 10% you would say would really know what is a tragic story. It's one of those stories that almost like reading your book, I knew a wee bit about it, but just reading it, you're like, how does that happen? And it's such a fascinating story. And just kind of speaking to the people you spoke to in that, how kind of much did that open your eyes of just how big a story that was in Scottish football? Because it is one of those that is probably, when you think of the history of Scottish football, it's a story unlike any other when you think about it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Third Lanark were one of the founding members of the Scottish Football Association. They had not a huge amount of success, but they were successful. They won the league. They're, I think, to date, one of only 4, maybe 5 teams that have beaten both halves of the Old Firm in the Scottish Cup final, which
Yeah.
in itself is an incredible feat. They were a long-established and well-established Scottish football club, and in Glasgow at that. I'm sure fans of Partick Thistle and Clyde and Airdrie, etc., would tell you how hard it is to stand out in Glasgow when you've got Rangers and Celtic there. But Third Lanark really did. They held their own, and they had a really dedicated, passionate following. So the idea that a club like that was, I think, third in the top flight, such as it was only 2-3 years before they went out of business, the fact that they could go out of business, I think the thing that struck me was the vulnerability of football clubs. Because it doesn't matter who you are, you grow up supporting a football team, whatever team that may be, and you think they're invincible. They probably existed before you did, and you just assume that they'll always be there. But when you strip back the romantic elements of it and the pure sporting parts of it, football clubs are just like any other business, and they're as vulnerable as any business. All it takes is a bit of bad luck, bad leadership, crooked management, whatever it might be, and those businesses can fail. So it struck me that there's really, I don't believe in the expression too big to fail. Barcelona have challenged that a little bit in the past few years, but then you look at other clubs, Rangers being a good example, Wimbledon being another, even Parma over in Italy. Football clubs can and do go out of business. And I think the circumstances of Third Lanark's demise were just so avoidable, and I don't know, had they been around today and suffered similar problems in the boardroom, would they've gone out of business? Don't know. I mean, administration didn't exist as something back in 1967. That only happened with the Insolvency Act in the mid-80s. Social media might have changed things, attention on them might have changed things, but it's all moot, isn't it? It didn't, because it didn't exist, and it happened the way it happened. So a really sad tale, and to be honest, I was just surprised that there wasn't a book about it already. There are some Third Lanark books out there that tell the history of the club, but none that really went into detail about how they died and why they died. So that's what I wanted. That's the starting point for me, was I just wanted to know more. So I ended up basically writing the book that I wanted to read.
And before we get into talking about your third book, Gallus, I would be remiss if you're on, obviously, the deputy editor bunkered. We've just finished with the Ryder Cup only a couple of weeks ago, and as two massive golf fans as we are, it's the sport in the past kind of 2 years has been a very strange one. It's been a very different golf. We've seen a big culture change in terms of live and the kind of infighting with the PGA and things like that. And I remember saying to one of my friends who we do the golf show with on here, it rekindled a real enjoyment out of watching golf. I thought the level of competition was outstanding. I thought the standard of golf was as good as I've seen in a long time. Would you kind of go along with that, like the emergence of kind of Victor Hovland coming up, and we saw the likes of John Ram, and even kind of like just players like Seb Straka, who just had such a good 3 days, and it rekindled a real kind of buzz of the sport for me again, just to how good Europe were. And even kind of saying this time last year, I mean, I was very much saying this is going to be an American win. America are going to do it. And just that turnaround, and we saw a bit of disarray in the American kind of dressing room and things like that. It was a real exciting Ryder Cup. It was good. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I would absolutely agree with that. It was a great Ryder Cup. I've been privileged enough to attend now 4 of them. The first one in Wales 2010, then Gleneagles, Paris, and now Rome. And yeah, it's a golf event unlike any other. It's hugely entertaining. It's completely and utterly unpredictable. I think most people did have the Americans down as favourites. They usually are favourites. I mean, the Europeans are typically underdogs on paper, aren't they? But I think that's something that they thrive on. But yeah, I think that a lot of praise has to go to Luke Donald. I thought that he, was a fantastic captain. Didn't have long to be a captain either. Only appointed in August 2022 after Henrik Stenson's move to Live saw him get sacked. Usually captains get the guts of 2 years to work on it, and Luke Donald had 12, 13 months. So I thought he was a tremendous leader, very quiet, very meticulous, but equally incredibly passionate. And I thought he got every major decision correct, from the captain's picks to playing foursomes in the opening session to the order he put his singles out in. He just got it absolutely right. And yeah, it was. Your point about Liv's really interesting. It hadn't actually occurred to me until just now, but I think the fact that for that week in Rome, no one talked about Liv. You know, I think about the media centre, there was just no discussion really about Liv Golf or even any of the personalities that have joined Liv. You know, for the record, I've got nothing against Liv. I think it's perfectly entitled to exist. You know, I don't like the idea of monopolies or duopolies or whatever they might be. I think competition is healthy. I think that much wringing of hands and pearl clutching about where the money comes from, I get the objections. Equally, I think there are many valid counter arguments to that. If you look at, you know, the fact that the DP World Tour did go to Saudi Arabia and there wasn't much said about that. It goes to China, it goes to Vietnam, it goes to places with terrible human rights records. You know, if you look at even Ireland in the 1990s, wasn't exactly a great place to be if you were a single mother, for example, and how far back you want to go to about the 60s with America and the civil rights movement and all the dreadful things that were happening over there at that time. So I do understand the objections, but by the same token, I think that if the Saudi Arabian government is sincere in what it says about wanting to change and having this vision for change, then who are we to close a door on them? And if any player wants to go and be part of that and make hundreds of millions in the process, how can any of us judge them? Because what would we do? It's, you know, I can't judge them because no one's handed me a check for 100 million and said, what do you think? You know, it's very different, I'm sure, when you get that. So yeah, it's been a complex time for the sport. It's been a lot of rancor and schism, but the Ryder Cup was, yeah, it was a pleasant distraction, pleasant diversion, and a reminder of just how good golf is.
Do you think as well, like when I mean, the Saturday morning, for example, Scheffler and Koepka, I mean, Koepka obviously a major winner. Scheffler, I still maintain the best golfer in the world from tee to the front of the green. Like, he's on a different level. But to see them getting defeated the way they did, and were you surprised the way it kind of fell apart for the Americans? Like, it was a really strange one when you looked at the togetherness at Whistling Straits. It was such a turnaround in 2 years to go from that, because you looked at that. Even I remember Koepka and DeChambeau just looking like a partnership then, and now we're looking at it and it just looked such a divided unit.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the Americans got a lot of decisions wrong. I think that Zach Johnson made some pretty key mistakes, the American captain. I think that he set himself up for failure with the vice captains that he picked. You know, Davis Love, fine, he won the Ryder Cup as captain in 2016, but only after throwing it away, frankly, in 2012 at Medina.
Yeah.
Then you had Steve Stricker, who did fantastically as a captain in 2021, but to suddenly see him in that, you know, secondary position, you know, that relegated role of vice captain, I think was a little bit jarring. Then you had Jim Furyk, who must wake up in the middle of the night sweating about the Ryder Cup. He's got a terrible record in the match. And Fred Couples, who, despite being one of the most popular guys in the game, is just an absolute rampant liability for a captain. You know, you tell him something, he's going to run out and tell the world, it feels like. So, yeah, he made some pretty poor decisions. I think the fact that it didn't play the American team, really, any of them, for 5 weeks between the end of the PGA Tour season and the Ryder Cup was, on reflection, a terrible mistake. The Europeans came in much fresher, having played pretty much throughout September. But yeah, I look at that result on the Saturday morning with Koepka, Scheffler against Hovland and Oberg, and it's just a freak result, isn't it? I mean, yeah, it was quite something to see Scotty Scheffler in tears afterwards. But you know what, I quite like that as well, because it shows that he cares. You know what I mean? For the longest time throughout my career in covering the Ryder Cup, there's been this idea that the Americans just don't care, and you know, Tiger Woods, who didn't want to be there and all that sort of stuff. When you're moved to tears because, I think it tells you absolutely everything that these guys, you know, contrary to popular opinion, really do care about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was such a good weekend, and it's something, obviously, Bob McIntyre as well being part of that as well. It was brilliant for him, because I remember kind of speaking about it, and we were saying, "Oh, will he qualify? Will he?" And he just, you saw the passion he has, and just a real kind of sense, like we've seen with Montgomery in the past and things like that. There's like the Scottish players in Ryder Cup, they do really well, but McIntyre, this could be his first of many. He just had that, like, he took it so well. You know what I mean? His performance, I thought, in the singles was really good. He had such a good week when you think about it, and just his kind of perseverance to get there, it just was so good.
Yeah, and I think considering he made it a very stated goal, you know, probably a couple of years ago that he wanted to be on this team, and he made it a priority, made no secret of the fact that he wanted to be there. To then qualify in the circumstances that he did at the qualifying, there was a lot of talk about Bob going into the week that, you know, is he going to play, you know, that often? There was a suggestion that he might only play on the Sunday from some people. Others said, you know, well, 2, but probably that'll be the only number of times he'll play. He was struggling off the tee in practice, but, you know, look, he played 3 times in the end. He won twice and half the other. Didn't lose. One of only 3 players not to lose out of the 24 that pegged it up. 2.5 points. The second best Scottish debut in the Ryder Cup of all time behind Paul Lawrie.
Yep.
Bob did us proud. He did his family proud. He did Oban proud, but most of all, he did himself proud. Yep. And I'm absolutely delighted for him. He's a top lad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope it's the first of many appearances in the Ryder Cup
hoping.
for him. Here's hoping. We'll go on to obviously talking about your newest book, Gallus, and that the overall subject, and we'll get into the kind of main points of the game and things like that, and the kind of cultural impact it had in Scottish football. But what was it about this book that you thought was the next target, the next project? What was it that kind of appealed to you about it?
It's funny, it was actually my publisher's idea. So the previous 2 books were my idea. I pitched them to him and he said, yeah, on you go, crack on. With this one, he came to me and he said, look, I've been thinking about something on the Scotland-England 1967 game. And he cited the example of a guy that we both know really well and have a lot of respect for, and that's Tom English. And Tom wrote a book called The Grudge about the Scotland-England rugby match, the Grand Slam decider, basically in 1990. Not just the match itself, but the wider cultural and societal implications of it, and the context in which it took place with Margaret Thatcher's government and what they were doing in Scotland at the time. So Pete approached me with the idea and said, look, do you think there's anything on this? And at first I thought, you know what, it's a nice idea, but I'm not sure there's much more to say, because the match has that place in Scottish history. It's probably, in a weird way, it's probably our biggest footballing success.
Yeah.
Because we've never made it out of the group stages of a major international tournament. These days we celebrate rightly qualifying for them, but in terms of contending for trophies, we've never come close. If you don't count the Kirin Cup, that is. And, you know, I looked at that game and I just thought, well, we've all seen Jim Baxter's keepy-uppies. We know we beat them. We know they were world champions. Is there much more to be said? And I thought, you know what, I'm going to think about it and have a look. And I gave myself probably a week or so to have a think about it. And it was during that time that I thought, wait a minute, was it not around then that Winnie Ewing won her seat for the SNP in the Hamilton by-election? And when I looked it up, sure enough, that happened in the November of the same year. The Scotland-England game was in April. So a few months later, Winnie Ewing won her seat. I thought, that's quite interesting. Scottish nationalists winning only their second ever seat at Westminster, and the circumstances they did, and what was previously seen as a very safe seat. And then you sort of work your way back. You think England winning the World Cup, did that kickstart something in terms of Scottish identity? And, you know, was that the genesis of the modern Scottish nationalist movement? So I thought, right, I'm going to pull on that thread and see where I get to. And when you draw the parallels between what was going on in Scottish society against what was happening on the football pitch, they're pretty compelling. So as soon as I had that, and I thought, yeah, wait a minute, we might be able to draw some conclusions here. That's when I thought, yeah, I want to take this idea forward. So yeah, for me, it's always just about how you can add to the story and how you can bring a story to life. With Third Lanark, I wanted to try and tell the side of the version of events according to the family of the nefarious chairman or club owner at the time, which had never been told. That's where I started. That was my starting point for that. And with this, it was kind of similar. It was almost less to do with the football and more to do with what else.
And it's fascinating, like you talk about the kind of cultural impact. I mean, people think of the 60s as this kind of the Beatles and we're in the middle of Harold Wilson's Labour and things like that. But I mean, you look at kind of videos from the past, and there's a lot of protests in Vietnam, for example. You've got, as you said, you mentioned earlier, you've got the civil rights in America, your kind of Arab-Israel war, and it's a fascinating subject to be talking about now. But there is a lot of weird kind of cultural comparisons, and we're looking at a Scotland-England game and saying this is the kind of apex of this rivalry that's going on for 100 years. But it is that, as you say, like Scotland, this was their moment to be up against the world champions. This was the big moment for Scottish fans, and always kind of we'll talk about that. And that was the big kind of thing for a lot of kind of Scottish people at the time, was Scotland were dominating in football. When you look at, I don't kind of know like if this is kind of relevant, but Scottish teams at this point in time, Celtic in the obviously European Cup final, go on to win it. Rangers get beaten in a Cup Winners' Cup final as well. Kilmarnock, they end up in the semi-final of the Fairs Cup. I mean, Scotland ruling the roost in European football at the moment. And then you've got the national team going up against the world champions, and not just any world champions, the world champions for down the road. It's such a fascinating time in Scottish football, and did you kind of realise that as well? That this is the kind of biggest moment in Scottish football, because not only is the national team doing well, our clubs are pretty good at this point as well.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, it all kind of happened in the same sort of 6-7 week period.
Yeah,
you had Dundee United beating Barcelona home and away as well, and then narrowly losing out to Juventus. So yeah, it was a real. I hate expressions like golden era, but it really was. I mean, if you want to put a full stop on Scottish football right now and say when were we at our best, well, 1967 was absolutely it, for all the reasons that you outlined. And yeah, I think that there was, for the Scottish players at that time, there was a real sense of, I guess, pride had been wounded by England winning the World Cup, because they all believed that they were at least the equal of anything that England had. And England had an absolutely extraordinary team at that point. Absolutely unbelievable side, with a manager who was inspirational beyond measure. And that was the part that we were maybe lacking at international level up until then. It took England winning the World Cup for the SFA to go, oh, wait a minute, the way that we're doing this isn't actually getting the best out of the talent we have at our disposal. We need to copy their blueprint and see where we go with it. So for the players, yeah, it was definitely a real opportunity to settle a score, right or wrong, whatever you want to call it. And for Scottish fans, I do think it spoke to something bigger. The old colonial inferiority complex that we all seem to have. It's identified by another writer as the St Andrew's fault. This idea that we have this almost small man syndrome when it comes to England, that we feel rightly or wrongly that they look down on us, that we've been oppressed by them for decades, centuries, whatever, and that therefore we must take the fight to them any opportunity. Proper David and Goliath stuff. So there was a lot of interesting threads to pull away at, and yeah, it was a lot of fun to write, I have to say.
Obviously, Bobby Brown comes in, takes the job. Obviously, the kind of Rangers goalkeeper and a well kind of renowned figure in the game at that point. How big an appointment was that, and a kind of old-fashioned kind of Scottish football figurehead, which I still maintain Scottish football teams at club and national level always do well with. He had such an impact on that team, didn't he? Coming in and getting his own chance to kind of bring players in, and who he brings in we'll touch on in a second. But his arrival was so big for that, the charisma of that side.
Massive, yeah, absolutely. They'd had Jock Stein there previously prior to his Celtic success. And then John Prentice, who came on board and was very quickly shown the door when it appeared as though he wanted to try and get a job with a North American Soccer League outfit when it was just starting up, and that's where a lot of money was. Yeah, I think that Bobby Brown was a pretty shrewd appointment. I also think it's fair to say he wasn't the first choice. There were other people in the frame, the likes of Malky MacDonald, who was doing such a great job at Kilmarnock at the time, and took over for a handful of games. But yeah, I think that what Bobby Brown brought was a real sense of clarity, purpose, determination, and quiet confidence. He wasn't a particular extrovert, despite the fact he played in goal. I think the theory is that all goalies have to be a little bit crazy, but he sort of bucked that trend a little bit. He was a very quiet, studious guy, very humble background, but absolutely knew how he wanted football to be played and how he wanted his teams to play. When you apply that to the international setup, that can yield different results. It can either go very well for you, it can go very poorly. And I think the SFA maybe saw in Bobby Brown a little bit of what the FA saw in Alf Ramsey when they appointed him, a guy that had earned his stripes with smaller clubs, had a successful career playing, and was just ready for the next step. And I think that's probably why they entrusted him. Very little ego, I think, is the big thing about Bobby Brown. He was content to let his players be the stars, and he just tried to set them up for success the best way he possibly could.
And he does obviously kind of gamble with his team selection. We'll get into the game, and a few players I want to touch on. The start, obviously, at goalkeeper, he picks Ronnie Simpson, who was obviously doing really well at that point and is part of the Celtic side. But it goes on. It was some sort of was he an apprentice to Bobby Brown? He was part. Was he at Queen's Park with Bobby Brown?
Queen's Park, yeah.
What swung it for him? Do you think?
I think there were a couple of things that helped. Certainly the form of Bobby Ferguson at Kilmarnock, who had been the Scotland first choice by and large up until then. He'd lost a bit of his form, wasn't playing particularly well, and I think it was also the fact that Ronnie Simpson pretty much thought his career was over until he got the call to go to Celtic. Managed to force his way into the team and just was such a key, integral part of that all-conquering side of 66-67. A lot of praise is rightly lauded on the likes of Gemmell and Jinky Johnson and Stevie Chalmers and so on, Bobby Lennox too, but every good team needs a really good goalkeeper. It wasn't like Celtic weren't allowing teams to pot shots at goal against them when they played them. So he was by no means a passenger in that Celtic side or a bystander. And yeah, I think it was a combination of his form and the poor form of others that convinced Brown to give him a go. 36 years of age to be making your Scotland debut. It's quite something, but as it turned out, it was full value for it.
He absolutely was. And another player, and there's a fascinating story I've got here. I actually have a copy of the team sheet for that game, and Jimmy Johnston is on the team sheet. But he does not obviously start the game. He gets replaced from his fellow Lisbon Lion, Willie Wallace. Talk us through the story behind that, because that was something that always fascinated me until I got it told by probably somebody we both know pretty well. He told me the story of Jimmy Johnson being replaced, but I'll let you tell us how did Jimmy Johnson miss his place?
Jimmy was meant to be playing. He had a bit of he was a character, Jinky, no question. Had been left out of some squads, in the run up to it for disciplinary reasons, shall we say. But he was playing for Celtic on the Wednesday night. So the Scotland-England game was the Saturday. The Wednesday before that, Johnson was playing against Dukla Prague in the European Cup. Got injured, went to Celtic Park on the Thursday morning whilst the rest of the team were gathering at Glasgow Central to head down to London. And the physio worked on him and eventually just had to say, look, it's no use, you're not going to be fit to play on Saturday. And at that point, Bobby Brown called up his Celtic teammate Willie Wallace, which caused a bit of a stooshy because Stevie Chalmers, another Celtic player, was already with the squad as the travelling reserve. So remember, this is a time before substitutions, which turned out was pretty pivotal in the match, as I'm sure we'll get to. But yeah, there was a time before substitutions and you were able to take a few travelling reserves. And generally, it was a goalkeeper, a defender to cover any position across the back. And this instance, I think it was, if I remember rightly, Ian Ure or Frank McClintock, I forget which. Frank, I think maybe. And the forward replacement was Stevie Chalmers. So conventional wisdom was Chalmers will take the place of Jinky Johnson. And Bobby Brown went, no, and called up Willie Wallace instead, who was summoned to Celtic Park by Jock Stein, told to gather his stuff and make his way down there as soon as he possibly could, because he was getting pitched straight into the team for Saturday. So he had basically 48 hours to think about it, went from not being involved at all to being in the starting 11, which is quite incredible.
The other one is obviously the kind of big addition to that team was a youngster at Coventry City with the name of Jim McCalliog. He comes in from right out of the blue, but it was one thing I kind of heard as well was kind of Bobby Brown's eye for a player, and McCalliog was a little known player, but boy does he make an impact very quickly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. McCalliog played in the under-23s international a couple of months prior and impressed in the win at St James's Park. And you're right, he moved to England at a very young age, still 15, 16, joined Leeds United, was an apprentice under Don Revie.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't happy eventually with the amount of game time he was getting, and the fact that Don Revie backtracked on a promise that he'd made to him in terms of the deal he was going to get when his apprenticeship was up. So he moved to Chelsea, where he then developed further under Tommy Docherty and did very well there until, again, he decided, I want to move again. At that point, Alan Brown and Sheffield Wednesday came in for him, and off he popped back up to Yorkshire. He played in the FA Cup final the year prior at Wembley, so had some experience of it. But I think to most Scottish football fans at the time, he was a bit of an unknown quantity. A slim, slender player, probably weighed 40 kilograms soaking wet. One of those ones, wasn't he? But yeah, I think he was probably the big surprise in the team sheet alongside Ronnie Simpson. But Jim is one of the nicest men in Scottish football. He's still going strong today. He's an absolutely lovely guy, and very humble to this day. And you can see it in him. There's still that sort of childlike quality that I think, childlike quality with a real maturity and a sense of occasion that I think probably appealed to Bobby Brown. And to be thrown in for your full Scotland debut against England when they're the world champions and you're playing them at Wembley, no mean feat, but I think it's testament to the character and the talent of McCalliog that he got the nod.
And the game obviously starts and Scotland go kind of 2 goals up, and it's a massive start. I mean, they're two really good goals, but what do you kind of look at when you think of Scotland going 2 goals up? Because it is not mostly, but there's a few players obviously for the team that played the year before and at the World Cup. And when you kind of look at the game and kind of assess it, how did Scotland manage to get that fast start? Because it's such a good display of taking the bull with the horns. And I want to get your thoughts, obviously, on Dennis Law in a wee bit and kind of link it in with Jim Batser. But the start's so good. It's such a fast start from Scotland in that game. Yeah,
I think that's the key thing is that, when you watch the match, I've watched it more times now than I care to remember, Scotland's intensity is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I think that it's true for most teams, even today, when they start with a real purpose and intensity and they take the game to the opposition, then, that's hard for the opposition to deal with. I look at, I'm a Rangers fan, so I hate to do it, but I look at like Celtic under Ange Postecoglou, the intensity that they played at was unlike anything that I've seen in Scottish football. That high pace, that high tempo, want the ball back in play as quickly as humanly possible, never stopping. That was very much what that Scotland team produced that day. From the kickoff, they were trying to play at a pace that I think England couldn't cope with. And it's important to remember that England team, in my opinion anyway, it was stronger than the 11 they put out to win the World Cup at Wembley 9 months prior.
Yeah,
Jimmy
Greaves plays in it, doesn't he?
That's right, yeah. There was only one change. So Roger Hunt goes out and Jimmy Greaves comes in. I mean, Jimmy Greaves, of all the people to bring in, a guy who made goal scoring look easy, just an absolutely prolific centre forward. So I think that the Scotland players all really took the fight to England and noised them up as well. I mean, when you get under the skin of the likes of Alan Ball and Nobby Stiles, Bobby Moore, then that's job one. Job two is then having the skill to get around them and, have them chasing you. So I think that definitely the intensity with which we started the game really set the tone. And for whatever reason, England didn't really seem to be playing at the same intensity as us. And it showed. The goal that we scored after, what was it, 28 minutes or so with Dennis Law, I mean, we could have been 3-0 up by that point.
Yeah, and it's that, obviously, with Jimmy Greaves and Dennis Law playing in that game, that two players who played in the famous game 6 years earlier than that at Wembley. And it's a kind of funny, like, people will say to look at 67, you need to look at 66. And I agree with that, absolutely. But you also, I think, need to look at 1961 and that horrendous 9-3 game. But what fascinates me about it is obviously Dennis Law is the only surviving player in that game who plays in 67, and he was on record very much saying, when Jim Baxter's playing keepy uppy, let's not take our foot off the gas, let's go for more goals. And Baxter's immortal line, which I think is one of the greatest line and probably the most Scottish thing I've ever heard, is it's better to take the piss. And that was Jim Baxter, but do you think that was a kind of pivotal moment for that Scotland team? Was it better for them to take the piss, or could they have had more goals? Because if you watch the game back, they absolutely would. They absolutely would have. Bobby Lennox as well. Bobby Lennox has about 4 chances, but Baxter's the immortal thing of that game is the Baxter keepy uppy. But
yeah,
you look at that game and think it could have been another kind of Wembley Wizards type result. It could have been if Scotland had pushed.
It could have been more. Equally, we could have attempted to score more and just ended up in the same score, or we could have conceded a few. I think that the reason that the game has been so mythologized and eulogized about for all these decades since, and more than half a century on, here we are still talking and writing about it, is because we did take the piss.
Yeah.
The fact that Jim Baxter not only had the presence of mind, but the ability to make world champions look silly. He humiliated them, and that was really if the scoreline was the first bit of red ink underneath that diary date, Baxter stuck another one under with his humiliation of them. That underscored just how significant that became. Had he not done it, would it still be talked about as much? Maybe not, because it's the first thing we all go to, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, the 67 game, Jim Baxter, keep you uppies, that's right. Most people, until they read the book, probably wouldn't be able to tell you who scored the 3 goals for Scotland that day, but they can all tell you about Jim Baxter's keepy uppies in lucid detail. So, yeah, I love the fact he did it. It was so.
It's a Scottish thing to do, isn't it? It's that, as you say, the Gallus nature. That's the title. It links all together, doesn't it?
And it was perfectly appropriate in the context of everything. Everything, the scoreline at the time, or the extent to which we were dominating them. It was appropriate in the context of, let's put them back in their place, both the England football team and for Scotland. Let's put England as a nation back in their place, bring them down a peg or two. So it was a seminal, pivotal moment, and I love the fact he did it. I wouldn't have it any other way.
And you mentioned there, obviously, about the Baxter keep you up as famous. What also kind of doesn't get mentioned very often is Jack Charlton scores in the 84th minute. And you're looking at, if you were looking at the game and didn't know the result, you think, is this the beginning of an England comeback? But for Jim McCallie, 3 minutes later, to put the game to bed, the youngest player on the team, I think, just to have have that mindset to just kill the game off. And how much does it, I think Bobby Brown obviously calls him the cog of that machine, and I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I think it was just Roy of the Rover stuff, really, wasn't it? To listen to Jim tell that story, I visited him at his house and spent quite a few hours with him just talking through the match, and I'll remember him telling the story of that goal till my dying day, because even now I get goosebumps thinking about his recollections of it. They're so clear. He hasn't forgotten a single millisecond of it. He can talk you through, well, the move started like this and such played it here, and the ball came into me and I looked up, and as he's telling me it, his voice then just started to tremble and his eyes filled up. And I think Jim's probably quite an emotional guy anyway. You can tell he's got that sort of soft, warm demeanour about him. Hard as nails in the football pitch, mind you, despite his physique. But yeah, I think he's just generally a nice, warm, endearing person. And when he tells that story, about hitting it as hard as he could underneath Gordon Banks. He turns around, peels away to celebrate. And as he does so, the first face that he sees is Dennis Law. And Dennis was his hero.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have football teams we support, but we also have a player that is just up there for us. For me, it's Brian Laudrup. And the idea that I could score a goal, on my international debut, turn around and somehow there's Brian Laudrup ready to celebrate with me. I mean, that is as good as it gets, really, isn't it? So for Jim to do that against the opposition he did it against, at the venue he did it, and as you rightly say, so late in the game when England were threatening a late comeback, it's the stuff dreams are made of.
And that whistle obviously goes and the kind of party starts and Wembley becomes a bit of a Scottish, a flood of Scots. And we see that again.
We did what we do best.
Yeah, and we see that obviously 20 years on with the famous victory at Wembley as well. But it's such a pivotal moment. But the one thing that kind of really fascinates me is Bobby Brown tells a story about when he walks down the street in London. I think, am I right in saying that the players were they in a cafe or something, and Bobby Brown just went a walk in the street and he bumps into a couple of fans. Is that story right?
That's right, yeah. So all the players went back to their hotel, got a quick change, and they all met up for various sort of ceremonial duties that had been put on for them, a fancy dinner and all that sort of stuff, and they're having a few drinks and they're all mingling together. And Bobby Brown tries to speak to Alf Ramsey, gets nowhere, and Alf's obviously giving him nothing and quite sort of monosyllabic with his answers. So Bobby Brown goes, "Sod this," gets up, goes outside of the venue and decides to just get a bit of fresh air, gather his thoughts at the end of what's been a huge day for him, never mind anybody else. And he's standing there in his official suit, quite the thing, and he sees this guy in a tartan tammy staggering towards him, zigzagging all the way up the pavement. He's obviously enjoyed himself greatly. And the guy walks past Brown, sort of stops, does a double take, and looks at him, goes back to him, jabs him a finger in the chest, and says, "England 2, Scotland 3, and don't you forget it." Obviously thinking that he's part of the England delegation, and then staggers away up the street. The amazing thing about that is that the chap who did it, if he's still with us, is probably completely unaware that it was him, that he saw Bobby Brown, because I don't imagine he would have remembered much the next day, given the state he was in. But yeah, just a great wee story, a great wee anecdote. And on a day that was absolutely full of them, there's so many Scotland fans that I've spoken to who were there, and they've all got their own memories of that occasion. Some of them can recall it better than others, because that's what we do in Scotland, don't we? We celebrate big wins like that, and my God, they celebrated in London that night.
And just kind of closing up on the importance of that result, and it's obviously the home championship, and kind of modern day fans will not kind of realise the recognition of that, but it was such a pivotal game because it meant Scotland won it that year, but it was also a chance for Scotland to qualify for the Euros. They obviously didn't do so, but the impact of that result culturally and for a football fan at the time, just kind of sum it up as best you can, just how much of an impact that had.
I think from a point of view of Scottish wider society, it was important, restored a little bit of pride. And it just, as I said earlier, I think it played to that sort of cultural inferiority complex. It maybe just gave us some bragging rights for a little while. Beyond that, it's probably the earliest known instance of glorious failure, because following that game, as you say, we were in such a good position to qualify for Euro 68 with the way the qualifying worked. They took the British Home Championships across 2 years, and the team that had the best combined score across the two championships qualified for the Euros. We won the championship, so that was a halfway stage, and we had won the championship that year, and we were in such a good position to qualify for the Euros from then on. But then we did what we've made a habit of. We stumbled, I think it was against Northern Ireland in our next match back, and ultimately in the 67-68 British Home Championships, England pipped us. So off they went to the Euros, and there we were sitting at home once again. So yeah, it was probably the earliest known instance of that. And I think the biggest, most lingering regret that people have is that was the only time that those 11 players ever played together.
Yeah.
They never got the opportunity to do it again. It was also pretty close to the end of the career for Jim Baxter at international level. I think he only played a couple more times. Dennis Law obviously stuck around and did finally make it to World Cup, albeit his role was greatly diminished. But yeah, it was a great result that ultimately meant absolutely nothing, which is one of the sort of the tragic themes of the book. I mean, and I was well aware about that from the outset. I was writing a book about not really a success. There was no, fine, you got the British Home Championship, big deal. How many times did we win that? Nobody knows. So if you don't know how many times, then you can't think it's a big deal. It's like when the people say about Tiger Woods, he's won 18 majors. Yeah, what's his Ryder Cup record? Well, there you go. It shows that majors count. So the fact that we won that match didn't really mean anything, and I was so aware of that writing the book that what I really hope, I mean it sincerely, I hope that this current group of players that we've got with Steve Clarke, when they go to Germany next year, do get out of the group stages, that they take us somewhere we've never been before, into the knockout rounds, and that hopefully six in inverted commas like 67 become a footnote. They don't become the thing for which we're most famous. I'd love nothing more than for people to stop talking about 67, because when they do, it means that we've had more success in the era. That's where I hope we get to, after we've sold a few books, obviously. But and it's a definition of success, because and I cover this later on in the book, but if you're Germany, England, Italy, Brazil, Argentina, qualifying for a major tournament is a nothing. It just doesn't register. If you win it, that's something. But qualifying isn't anything to celebrate. For us, it is. I mean, we're currently just about 24 hours removed from knowing that we're guaranteed to be going to next year's Euros, and we are celebrating. It was the lead item on the news tonight.
Yeah.
Because that is what success looks like for a nation like us. For somebody like Finland or India, who have never qualified for the World Cup, are we meant to believe that just because it's not a big deal to Germany and Brazil to qualify for the World Cup, that if and when they do, they shouldn't celebrate it? So success is relative. In the context of Scottish football, our biggest relative success is the fact we beat the reigning world champions on their home turf 9 months after they did it. I'd love for the story of Scottish football, given how much we've contributed to the sport, our place in the sport's history, given the players that we have produced throughout the last 150 years, I would love it if we've got something bigger to talk about going forward. Maybe next summer will provide us with that, but we'll wait and see. As ever with Scotland, it's the hope that kills you, but yeah, fingers crossed next time it won't be that.
And the kind of final question I want to ask is, obviously, writing a book like this, you'll have spoken to people who were there at the time, who were coming. You mentioned obviously speaking to Jim and kind of his stories and his personal kind of point of view in the game, but who were kind of some of the others you spoke to for the book, and how do you kind of remember that? Like, as a fan of football, you mentioned there obviously about being a fan, to speak to these greats who were there at the time and have kind of been legends of our game, to speak to them and get their kind of point of view. How does that kind of feel for you as well?
Yeah, I must admit, like, I've got a picture of Jim and I in his house, standing next to a picture on his wall of him and Dennis Law. They met because Manchester United played Sheffield Wednesday the week before, or in the week leading up to the game, and Jim had obviously got his place in the team at that point. So the London papers hastily arranged this handshake with them before Man United played Sheffield Wednesday. And Jim has that picture framed and signed by Dennis on his wall. We've got a picture, he and I standing next to it, and yeah, I cherish that. It's a great wee photo, and something I tend not to, ask for selfies or autographs from people I interview, because I think it's such an abuse of a privilege. I'm quite lucky in what I do. I get to speak to a lot of people that are high profile, and I've met a lot of great sports people. But I also know the only reason I'm doing that is because I'm there to do a job, so I don't want to try and abuse a privilege by asking for an autograph from them. With Jim, I felt that, I can't let the opportunity go by. The guy scored such a great goal and it was so meaningful. As I say, I do hope it will become less meaningful in time, but for now it's important. So yeah, I cherish that. And spoke to Willie Wallace, who's now based in Australia. I say now, he's been there for decades. A great character. Him and his wife Olive are absolutely lovely. I spoke to them in the early hours of the morning because of the time difference. The great sadness for me, if there is one, and this isn't a regret, it's just a disappointment, is the fact that I wish I did this book 10 years ago, because so many of the players on both teams are no longer with us.
Yeah.
And some of those who are not particularly well.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have loved to have told a few more of their stories. As it was, I was able to speak to family members and, find old interviews that they'd done that hadn't ever really seen the light of day, that helped add context. But yeah, I would have loved to have spoken to more of the players in the England team, for example, about their memories of it. If anything, maybe that's just the one part that's missing, although I do think we've managed to get a lot of perspective from them based, as I say, on those historic interviews. But I would have, on a personal level, I would have loved to have spoken to them myself to get that stuff. I can't deny it. I would have loved to have spoken to Dennis Law and Jim Baxter as well. Dennis, still with us. He's obviously, struggling a bit at the moment.
Yeah.
But he's the greatest footballer Scotland's ever produced, and no one will ever convince me otherwise. Jim, possibly the most talented footballer Scotland has ever produced. Maybe not the greatest player, but certainly the amount of talent he had was off the charts. Characters, that endure to this day and that are going to endure for a hell of a lot longer. It's funny, there's a really old cheesy phrase that someone once told me, and they said that everyone dies twice. Once when you physically die, and then again sometime later when somebody says your name for the last time.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Baxter and Dennis Law will be around for, I genuinely believe, centuries to come.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that is kind of the beauty of the book as well, is that you're keeping that character going, like, as you say, like players like, I think of players like Eddie McCready and like Willie Wallace, for example. These guys, brilliant moments for them, and such a good kind of era of Scottish football. And we're unofficial world champions for a small bit, and that's the beauty of the book as well. And Michael, I want to thank you very much for joining me in this episode of the book club, and kind of helping share your story of this brilliant book. And I urge all our viewers to check it out, and we will post a link as well. But I want to thank you very much for joining me, and I really appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure's been all mine. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope everyone listens and enjoys the book.
Yeah, I think they certainly will. Thank you very much to everyone that's tuned in. Please buy Gallus, Scotland, England, and the 1967 World Cup, and follow the link and subscribe. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon. Cheers.